Chernobyl, the endless night. On the night of April 25, 1986, in a place in northern Ukraine, an ordinary night was passing in quietness, no different from any other. Yet at that very time, an event was beginning unnoticed that would completely change the course of human history. Suddenly, a thunderous roar tore through the sky and shattered the stillness of the night. And it was not the artillery of war, but an explosion born of human error and arrogance. After the moment when flames and black smoke surged upward, along with a radioactive cloud that carried an invisible death, the world could never return to what it had been. Pripyat was a planned city built in 1970 on a barren plain where there had been nothing. Constructed for the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families, the city was a symbol of the modernity the Soviet Union took pride in. Its orderly streets, blue and white buildings, and systematically designed urban layout seemed to bring the socialist ideal into reality. The city had schools and hospitals, theaters and parks, a swimming pool and gymnasiums, and people believed it would remain safe and stable for a long time. In the streets of Pripyat, scenes of children riding bicycles and families taking walks unfolded as if every day, and young parents naturally expected a bright future within a stable life. On the outskirts of the city, an amusement park was being prepared, with a Ferris wheel overlooking broad grasslands and colorful rides installed as it awaited its opening. The phrase that the average age was 26 symbolically showed how young, lively, and hope-filled the city was. No one could have imagined, not even in a dream, that the city would soon become a ghost town. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a massive facility symbolizing the Soviet nuclear industry. People believed that cheap, clean, and almost limitless energy was produced there, and they called it the fuel of the future. Electricity generated at the plant was supplied to homes, schools, hospitals, and industrial facilities in nearby towns and villages, functioning like a great heart that kept the entire region moving. Yet at the same time, there was also the truth that nuclear power, if not properly managed, held dangers beyond ordinary imagination. At the Chernobyl plant, multiple RBMK reactors of the same design had been installed. At the time, 4 units were operating, and the other 2 were still under construction even when the accident occurred. This enormous complex appeared to be a symbol that displayed the technological strength and national pride of the Soviet nuclear industry, and the surrounding region depended on its power to function. But the larger and more complex the system, the more a single small flaw could shake the whole, and Chernobyl carried precisely that kind of vulnerability. That weakness was quietly growing out of sight, remaining as a risk that would one day demand its price. The RBMK reactors installed at Chernobyl had serious structural design flaws, and in particular, the characteristic of becoming more unstable as power fell was a factor that increased the likelihood of an accident under dangerous conditions. In addition, the graphite used inside the reactor had the property of greatly amplifying the nuclear reaction, so if control faltered, the reaction could surge far more violently than expected. Most fatal of all was that, in the event of an accident, there was no fully adequate containment structure to completely confine radiation. These defects remained as hidden dangers without being publicly known, weakening what looked like a sound system from within. Even before the accident, technicians and engineers at the site reported the reactor's dangers many times, and concerns were repeatedly raised, especially about instability at low power and hazardous behavior under certain conditions. But managers and government authorities did not take these warnings seriously, and production targets and political pressure came before safety, while the words, "there is no problem," were more easily accepted. As a result, the Chernobyl plant continued operating, and the city of Pripyat kept expanding as it thrived. The seeds of disaster were clearly growing, but no one tried to stop them, and no one even believed they could be stopped. On the night of April 25, 1986, a test was planned at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl plant to check safety systems, with the aim of confirming how long the turbine's inertia could provide power even during a blackout. Technicians and managers on site regarded it as a simple procedure to be finished quickly, and because similar attempts had been made before, an atmosphere prevailed that it could not become a big problem. Yet no one could even imagine that this test might lead to the most serious nuclear power plant accident in human history. That night wore the face of ordinary work, but in reality, it was a night when the door to disaster was quietly opening. As the test proceeded, unexpected problems began to appear, but those in charge decided to push ahead, and safety rules and standard procedures began to be ignored one by one. Reactor power fell far outside the normal range to a dangerously low level. The control room instruments fluctuated unsteadily, and warning alarms sounded again and again. But the test did not stop, and as the judgment just a little more accumulated, choices that added crisis to crisis continued. The reactor was slipping deeper and deeper into a state beyond control, rolling in a direction where it could no longer apply its own brakes. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, a rapid chain reaction began inside the reactor, and as pressure and heat rose beyond control, even devices that normally functioned as safety mechanisms could not respond properly. Valves and control systems failed to work, and although the emergency shutdown button was pressed, it was already too late. Then, with a blinding flash, a massive explosion occurred. This was not merely an accident, but the moment the world faced the words nuclear catastrophe as reality. With the explosion, the entire reactor number 4 building shook violently. The reinforced concrete roof, weighing more than 1,000 tons, was hurled into the air, and subsequent explosions effectively destroyed the reactor core, leaving it fully exposed. A towering pillar of fire erupted, and radioactive graphite fragments and nuclear fuel particles were blasted into the sky, while invisible radiation spread in all directions, turning the air itself into danger from that moment on. Reactor number 4 continued to burn in a state beyond control. This was not just fire, and within the flames, deadly things that human eyes could not see were burning as well. In Pripyat, only 3 kilometers from the blast site, thousands of children were sleeping peacefully, and families believed that tomorrow too would bring an ordinary day. But at that very moment, a lethal radioactive cloud was moving quietly toward the city on the wind, and an invisible, soundless, scentless death was approaching like the wind itself. The entire city slept, knowing nothing, and that silence soon became reality, beginning to settle over people's lives without any warning. Immediately after the explosion, firefighters and plant workers rushed to the site to extinguish the blaze. They thought it was a simple industrial fire, and they did not even properly understand what the danger of radiation meant. Without protective equipment, firefighters picked up and threw away burning hot graphite fragments with bare hands, and although they remained on site only for minutes, those minutes became the time that decided their fate for life. In that short time, lethal amounts of radiation were absorbed into their bodies. Without realizing it, they had already crossed a line that could never be undone. A firefighter with severe burns looked up at the sky in pain, and above the exploded reactor, a mysteriously violet light was spreading across the night. He whispered that it was beautiful, but it was Cherenkov radiation, created when extremely high radiation met the air, a scene in which death revealed itself in the form of light. Most of those who saw that light died within days in terrible agony. The beauty of that moment was, in truth, a final illusion cast over life, and the color of a terror humanity had not known. Morning came, but the air was already filled with lethal radiation, and the entire city, streets and rooftops, parks and playgrounds, was covered with invisible radioactive dust. Yet no alarm and no evacuation guidance came from the authorities, and the residents of Pripyat began their day as usual, continuing their routines with frightening naturalness. They had no idea that death was drifting through the air. So everyone carried on, walking through air that had already changed, as if nothing had happened. As time passed, strange symptoms began to appear among residents, and headaches, vomiting, a metallic taste in the mouth, and an unexplainable fatigue spread to more and more people. But people did not know the cause, hospitals could not give clear answers, and many simply brushed it off, thinking they were not feeling well, and continued their day. Children still played near the Ferris wheel that was soon to open, and families spent time in the park. It looked like an ordinary Sunday, but it was their last Sunday. Around the blast site, soldiers and scientists tried to grasp the situation, and even people who stayed there only minutes suffered extreme vomiting, burns, and skin damage, while radiation levels soared beyond measuring limits. But the Soviet authorities announced that the accident was under control and not dangerous. People needed the truth, yet the truth was thoroughly concealed. Meanwhile, reactor number 4 was still burning fiercely, and radiation continued to be released. The disaster was growing faster in the absence of truth, and silence left people defenseless. The radioactive cloud released from Chernobyl spread quickly on the wind, first contaminating much of Belarus, then moving into Poland and many parts of Eastern Europe. Days later, radioactive fallout was detected in Scandinavia, Germany, Italy, and even farther away, placing the entire European continent beneath an invisible cloud. But in the early days, most residents received no warnings at all. Silence made the disaster larger, and danger crossed borders in quiet motion. Even after the explosion, reactor number 4 continued to burn, and to prevent the spread of radiation, Soviet authorities deployed helicopters in an operation that repeatedly dropped sand, lead, boric acid, and clay over the reactor. But the air above the reactor was extremely hot, the updrafts were unstable, and pilots had to fly over an invisible danger amid intense heat and radiation. During the operation, one helicopter struck a crane cable in midair, lost balance, and crashed. The 4 crew members on board were killed instantly, but their sacrifice was not widely known for a long time. That fall from the sky was another invisible sacrifice, a tragedy that unfolded in the very heart of the catastrophe. Only after 36 hours had passed since the explosion did an evacuation order reach the residents of Pripyat. To prevent panic, authorities told them, "You can return in a few days," and those words sounded like a brief comfort. So most people boarded buses with only minimal belongings, leaving their house keys in the doors, and even leaving food on the tables and children's toys behind. They believed they would soon return, but this evacuation became a permanent farewell. In the end, no one could ever return to Pripyat, and the words 3 days became the cruelest lie that made people leave. On the afternoon of April 27th, hundreds of buses drove through Pripyat to pick up residents, and people left with their doors unlocked, leaving photos and toys, even food on the table, and all the traces of everyday life behind. In about 3 hours, all 45,000 residents left the city, and the scene of an endless line of buses slowly departing the empty streets showed the exact moment the city's life went out. In this way, Pripyat became a completely abandoned ghost city in just one day. A life that had grown for 16 years as a city of the future stopped in only a few hours, leaving only its traces scattered throughout the city. To contain the accident and prevent the spread of radiation, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, workers, firefighters, and miners from across the Soviet Union were deployed to the Chernobyl region. They were called liquidators, meaning those assigned to clean up and contain the disaster. And they removed radioactive debris, decontaminated polluted zones, and built protective structures, with many heading to the site without receiving sufficient explanation. The most dangerous missions took place on the reactor roof, where workers, wearing lead vests, went up and for only 40 to 90 seconds had to shovel radioactive graphite fragments and throw them back into the reactor. Other miners dug tunnels beneath the reactor without ventilation systems, fighting to prevent a second explosion, and countless people suffered lifelong pain or lost their lives because of this work. Immediately after the explosion, a pine forest covering about 4 square kilometers around the reactor was exposed to enormous radiation. The trees turned red as if burned from within, and the area came to be called the Red Forest. Its ecosystem essentially collapsed, animals fell ill or died, the soil and water were severely contaminated, and radiation levels there remain very high even today. Harm to humans continued as well. Hundreds of thousands suffered from thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other illnesses, and reports of birth defects and genetic impacts followed, leaving wounds that endured across generations. Chernobyl did not end when the fire went out. It kept breaking people and nature in an invisible time that continued on. Today, Pripyat is a ghost city where shattered buildings, rusted rides, abandoned schools, and hospitals remain as they were, and traces of April 1986 linger in dust and silence. Even so, some elderly people could not leave their homeland and return to live inside the exclusion zone despite knowing the risks, because to them this place is home before it is contaminated land. The Chernobyl disaster is not simply an event of the past, but a deep wound carved into human history, a catastrophe that is still ongoing. It remains in memory, endlessly reminding us how humble we must be before the power of nature, and how vital safety and responsibility truly are.